again to the Law, Policing and Justice Podcast, Episode 5. My name is Nurin Chowdhury. I am the lead and solicitor for the Legal Advice Centre at the University of East London, USS Stratford campus. Today's episode is a special one. We will be discussing the topic on interdisciplinary perspectives to law as a social science. We have two special guests today. First of all, we have here Dr. Michael Harrison, who is a senior lecturer in economics and finance and is the programme leader for undergraduate economics degrees in the Royal Docks School of Business and Law. His teaching spans modules in microeconomics, econometrics, please correct me, Michael, if I've said that wrong, and central banking. He is research active in the areas of high-frequency trading and market microstructure. Michael has also participated in interdisciplinary research projects which focus on financial crime, sustainable banking and emerging banks. In addition, Michael is experienced in media engagement and has appeared on the BBC One show and contributed to articles published in the Daily Express, New Law Journal, Finance Monthly and The Conversation. And Michael is also joined by his partner in crime, Dr. Olubunmi Onufuwa, who's a senior lecturer, amazing senior lecturer, and a researcher in law. I will let the students introduce themselves and then put their questions forward to both our special guests. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much. My name is Franz. I'm the final year LLB law student. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Chima Onwekwe Chimnoyelu, and I'm a first-year law student at the University of East London.
Hi, my name is Courage Agbebiusa Okoro. I'm a first-year law student at the University of East London studying business law.
I've got first question to ask you. Why is it that a legal researcher and economists can work well together? Can you just throw more light on that question for us, please?
Of course, perhaps I'll start and Bumi can follow. Outwardly, we're a very odd pairing together. It's rather a surprise that where one of us is, the other's usually about no more than 20 yards behind. Both economics and law are under the umbrella of social sciences, however they're at opposite ends of the spectrum. As an economist, it is necessary to understand a certain element of law, to understand how businesses operate, what they can and cannot do, and why certain forms of interaction that we think as economists should take place either does or does not take place. Now, perhaps for this podcast, it's helpful to define what economics is in plain language, since it's a law podcast, and I probably shouldn't hijack it too much. On paper, economics is the study of how to allocate resources. In reality, it's more or less a discipline which explains how people interact with each other. And it's very possible to examine how people interact with each other through the lens of the law.
So with law, don't really have to say too much because all disciplines they are guided by law, so and economics included. So we have written some other articles together on, as an interdisciplinary paper, and they do actually go well together because law is a social science, just, like economics. We look at how law impacts individuals, and it is in that sense looking at how law impacts individuals in society and, the role that economics plays in this kind of situation.
It's worth just adding one more point onto that. Most things boil down to money, and the one person who can explain how to make money and how to perhaps abuse money is an economist.
Thank you, Michael.
Anytime.
On to the second question. A while back, you published together in the New Law Journal about proposed changes to the classifications of nitrous oxide as a classified drug. What got you interested to write about that?
So I just wanted to say that this topic was brought to me by Michael, actually, and the law is obvious because has to do with nitrous oxide, and the main issue there is looking at what does the law, what are the plans with regards to how they're trying to curb it, and he brought it to me to look into. So I'll pass it on to Michael to start on.
I think we originally got interested in nitrous oxide simply by observing the world around us. I think at the time, Bumi and I used to walk over to the car park on the Water Lane campus quite often and see these little metal cylinders on the ground, and we're both very innocent people who didn't know what they were, but
True.
We're also both researchers, so we eventually found out. I've lived in various parts of East London, from far south as Beckton all the way up to Tottenham and pretty much everywhere in between. That's 3 boroughs, about 5 locales, and they're everywhere. They're not so common now, but there was a period a few years ago, just out the back of COVID, we're tripping over the things in the gutter. And so much good research is actually just based upon daily life and what you see around you. And I think both the topics that you're going to question us on today are from our everyday lives. Well, we got to be interested in it through observation, and what we found out was, around the time we published the article you mentioned, the government was proposing to change the legislation around nitrous oxide. Well, perhaps it's helpful to say what nitrous is. In plain language, it's laughing gas. Now, this is a medical drug. You can go, for many years it was common in dentistry before lidocaine to be gassed to have a filling done. It was nitrous. It's still used as a painkiller in hospitals today. If you show up in accident and emergency, you're quite often given gas, apparently. Fortunately, I've never been that unlucky. So it's not necessarily an illicit substance, but it's a substance that can have legitimate use or an illegitimate use. I'm told in small amounts it can create some sort of mild euphoria, but I've never put it to the test, and I won't ask any of you to disclose your activities. Especially as the law has changed since we've written the article. Yeah. But maybe you'll ask us on how the law has changed and whether we agree with it. It's classified as it's Class C now, you're right. Now, at the time we wrote the article, that the law governing the use of nitrous was the Psychoactive Substances Act of 2016. This made it illegal to deal in nitrous oxide, but it did not make illicit use of nitrous oxide a criminal offence. And the exact position doesn't seem to be set out in statute. Now, Bhumi looked into some common law analysis of this, so maybe I hand over to Bhumi quickly to just tell us about a few cases that have existed before the classification.
Yeah, absolutely. So I found 2 cases on this. The first one was in 2016. 2 defendants were acquitted after being charged with possession of nitrous oxide in Towton. So what the defence barrister did was argue that it was a medicinal product and commonly used during childbirth. During that time, it was still guided by the Psychoactive Substances Act. So it kind of more concentration on production, supply and importation of nitrous oxide. So, however, it did not cover possession. It didn't really, because it qualifies as a medicinal product. So they were able to argue successfully on their behalf, and they were acquitted due to this an argument. And I think the issue here was because it didn't cover possession, and also because they were able to argue that, okay, fine, it is illegal, but it isn't really illegal. You know, it wasn't really clear. So I think the vagueness kind of, which is why the government made proposals. When we wrote this article, it wasn't for definite that they were going to actually classify or criminalise the drug or laughing gas. It was more like they were looking into it. And as you already know, before they do that, they would have to kind of initiate an independent kind of advisory board to look into it and see if they do really need to criminalise it, like look at the effects on individuals and maybe if there's a concern there. The second case would be Sonny Chapman, and that was in 2017. So that was a year after, still using the same legislation. This individual had about 14,000 canisters. So obviously there was an intention to distribute, so an intention to sell. And this individual was sentenced to 2 years for possession and for selling nitrous oxide. So you can see kind of like the difference between the two. And one of the reasons why we kind of like looked into, so if you look at the first defendants or the first case, it's not like the other case where there was a large amount in that person's possession, which kind of like took us to the laws. Is it really necessary that they should criminalise this drug? We were looking at, and we also knew that it would be more than likely, it would be under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, where all the drugs are kind of set. And in that situation, there would be a fine, custodial sentence. It's kind of a massive upgrade.
That was the thinking at the time we wrote the article. About a year after we published it, we suddenly got a lot of interest, and New Law Journal re-socialed the article because last year the government did classify nitrous oxide as a Category C drug, exactly as Bhumi predicted a year previously, scheduled under the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971. Around the time that the government did take this action, it was estimated that around 2% of the adult population were abusing nitrous oxide. But if you actually look at the younger element of the population, about 9% of 16 to 24-year-olds were able to use nitrous oxide, and around 70% of adults said they knew where they could get nitrous oxide from, and around 29% said they could get it easily. And of course that matches what we saw around us, because the canisters are everywhere, and you quite often see people walking along the street taking huffs out of balloons, which apparently it's nitrous, but again, I'm too innocent to know for sure.
Following up on the previous question, why did you caution against stricter classification in your articles?
What a great question, because exactly what we cautioned against is what the government did. Now, Bhumi and I are partners in crime, but we are also partners in having rows. And this is where the interdisciplinarity also shines through. Because Bhumi and I both argued against stricter classification, but we argued against it for different reasons. I'll allow Olubunmi to explain her reasoning first, then I'll talk through mine, and we see if you want to follow up on that.
So the first thing that we would do anyway with law is look at what has been done with regards to, looking into whether it is actually necessary to do that. So they did have recommendations from the Advisory Council on the misuse of drugs, which declared that the sanctions would be disproportionate to the level of harm. So they had looked into it and just felt, it wasn't like a Class A drug, or they were not concerned. And I was expecting the government to take that into consideration. I also it was kind of reflecting on the young people, most probably kind of predicting that time it was a trend. And then you would find younger people with criminal records if they're found with this drug. So we wasn't sure under what class it would be. Suspected it'd probably be under Class C drug, but regardless, it's still the same. If anyone was caught under these classifications, there is a possibility that they would have a criminal record, regardless of whether it was a fine or up to 2 years custodial sentencing. And that would, so it's really strict. And that was the fear at that time, that there's peer pressure, and there's a fear that younger people would end up with criminal records, which could actually alter their future. So that was my argument with regards to that. So it was more like the impacts on these young individuals, especially because there are other things that come into play. There was issues with regards to educating, and no one's talking about educating the young people, putting it out there, instead of having adverts for maybe gaming or whatever, let's have adverts that talk about nitrous oxide and the damage it could do, because we're not saying it does not do damage. The advisory board did say the damage is limited, but it's not, they're not saying there's no damage. So that was actually my concern, and I thought at that time that we need to kind of protect our young ones, and this is our duty to society to ensure that they are well informed, because young people, they don't really know the impact of what it, and then when peer pressure comes into play, some parents or some people know it is not the right thing to do, but peer pressure is another thing, and that's actually for another day. So that was my angle.
Yeah, it's a really good point you make, Bhumi, around this being a trend or perhaps a hype. So at the time we were writing, about 9% of 16 to 24-year-olds were suspected to use nitrous. Latest Home Office data shows that that's dropped down to about 4%. Quite a significant decrease. Maybe a lot of the interest has gone away anyway, irrespective of the increased classification. But my argument against a strict classification was set more in an economic analysis of how nitrous was being bought and sold then, and what the alternative would be in a world of stricter classification. Naturally, you can't just go into Tesco's, or in this cost of living crisis, you can't go into Lidl or Aldi and buy nitrous in the same way that you buy chocolate biscuits. But before classification, it was semi-legal to buy and sell it. Now that it is a scheduled drug, it's a Category C drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act, the supply chain is much more likely to be pushed into the hands of criminal businesses. Well, criminal businesses is perhaps a very posh way of saying gangs. Now, I guess we've all lived in London a certain amount of time, and in certain other large cities in the UK, there's a lot of concern about gang activity and the wider violence that this causes, and the risk of young people who perhaps don't have a lot of life chances being caught up in gangs. Well, this requires us to try and understand what a gang actually is. And there's a great deal of academic research which shows that gangs actually operate like for-profit businesses. There's only one difference: they're not legitimate businesses. You are not going to pay tax if you're a gangster, but maybe that's a good thing. Again, I am associated with the UEL tax clinic, so I would like to disassociate their position from the comment I have just made. And what we see around is a lot of the supply of drugs, such as cannabis, is being pushed through localised gangs. You might not see the great element of gang-related violence if you're buying small amounts of cannabis, but the two are linked to each other. Now, that also allows us to drift toward the question as to, if gangs are businesses, they're selling something, not selling it legally, why do gangs engage in violence if they're really just businesses that are not official? Well, an official business is able to market very openly. They're often very able to brand and differentiate their product. In certain circumstances, a legitimate business can raise concerns over excessive competition with the Competitions and Markets Authority, and you're protected by competition law. Well, an illegitimate business has no such protection, but they can create barriers to competition through the use of violence. And that's why so many of the gangs that we sometimes read about in the news are postcode based. What they're in fact doing is using violence to gain a territorial or a postcode monopoly to sell illicit products. And heroin and cannabis have long been scheduled drugs, and they've long been the products du jour. We were very concerned that if nitrous, as a very popular drug, was being pushed into the hands of these criminal supply chains, it would increase the level of gang activity. We're also rather worried that the more people who engage as customers of these drug dealing gangs would lead to more young people being attracted into these gangs to work for them. And there's, again, a lot of research in the economics field, particularly by a famous American economist called Stephen Levitt. He wrote a book called Freakonomics and devotes about 2 chapters to this. Why do young people actually work for gangs? Well, firstly, Levitt argues that a Chicago crack gang actually has the exact same business model as McDonald's. It's franchise-based. Well, naturally, being an economist, I'm not too scared of numbers, so I ran the numbers. And I think if you work nearly full-time for McDonald's in London now, you might get about £270 a week. Not bad, not good. Trying to ask a crack dealer his wage is not the easiest thing to do, but based upon available research and current prices, we think for the same degree of activity to work for an illegal company selling, let us say, cannabis, you'll get about £480 a week. That's a significant difference. And I suppose I have to reveal the true narcissism of economics at this point and the training I have received, because my training is it's economically correct to take the highest income. So in pure economics, it's more correct to be a drug dealer than to work minimum wage in McDonald's. Now, I'm not saying morally that's correct. In law, it's certainly not correct.
Definitely not
I think
correct.
we've revealed the narcissism of
Absolutely.
economics as a rigid science through this example. And again, it shows why 2 of us working together is a good idea, because we restrain each other. I must also add that the advice I've just given is not the official position of the UEL Career Zone.
Definitely not.
But I say that to try and illustrate, why is it that young people are drawn into this? It's not because they're bad and they want to be a little word I can't say. Quite often the motive is very economic and very rational. And we feared that increasing the degree of classification would push it into gang-related activity and increase the level of gang-related activity, which the police don't seem to be very good at disrupting. So, for very different reasons to Boomi, I argued against classification as well. I think the one point where we did agree was if it was made a classified drug, people who did overdose would be less likely to go to hospital.
Absolutely.
That was a very obvious point that we both agreed on very quickly. But for those principal three reasons, we argued against classification, are critical of what the government has done.
Thank you very much, Michael. This is our last question. You have also written on the businesses. We just want to know what got you interested to this and what is the law around this, please?
Thanks, Francis. That's a great question. So we wrote about cash-only businesses around about a year ago. And again, this was based upon just observation of going to the shops. Many places where we go to spend our money, we're greeted with signs saying card only, or at times we also see small businesses especially saying we have a minimum card spend in our shops. Now, out the back of COVID, you see minimum spend £3. I walked past a chicken shop in Leighton yesterday. I didn't go in, and the reason I didn't go in was because they had a sign in the window saying minimum card spend £10. And, the mathematics in my head, 3 wings and chips, which is my evening meal, by the way, only costs £3.50. Being serious, no, I'm not jesting. Penalty of living in an up-and-coming area. Not big wings, not good chips, but £3.50. Anyway, minimum card spend £10. In a chicken shop, 3 wings and chips in that particular locale, £3.50. It clearly does not work. Out the back of COVID, we saw more and more businesses have drifted towards a tendency to not want to handle cash. They're card-only businesses. And what got us interested in this was the fact that Boomi and I both pay by card anyway.
Yes.
But there are those who are at great risk of being left behind, principally those who are not particularly tech-savvy, not financially literate. The elderly in general are much less likely to be confident using debit cards or credit cards. We also know that households who have very precarious income streams are much more likely to deal in cash and prefer to deal in cash as a budgeting tool. Some very low income households are more likely to be paid in cash and simply have cash with them. Despite the fact everyone thinks the UK's got one of the oldest banking systems in the world, we've got one of the most developed banking systems in the world, it's still the fact that we do have people in the UK who are underserved by banks. Underbanking is still a huge problem here. And a lot of the drift toward financial technology is not actually catching up with those who don't have a bank account and perhaps should have a bank account. For many years I've taught international students in our own university, and in the first term that they join us, one of the biggest problems that they have is going to the established banks and just getting a debit card or deposit account. And that, for all the years I've worked at UEL, that's been the principal problem of an international student in his or her first term. So there is clearly still a need to have cash in the economy at this point in time. So the second thing you asked us, Francis, was what's the law on this? And maybe shall I let Boomi explain the law a little bit and I can chip in a bit?
Yeah, so there isn't specific laws with regards to this. We in this article, focused on the elderly because we felt this is an ongoing problem. Yes, we're not against technology and, a thriving society needs advanced technology anyway. But we should also note that we're all going to be elderly at some point, and maybe now we're whiz with the computers and we can use cards, and maybe in the next 20, 40, 50 years we're not capable of doing that. So and this is where the mental capability comes in as well. So we do have people who are, adults, but they don't have the mental capability, and this is not to slag anyone off. It's just the reality of society. So we looked at the UK Equality Act of 1988, and it's all about having access to the economy. So if an elderly person says, I need cash, as part of the Equality Act, we believe that this protection should be, extended towards these individuals so that they can access their economy. So we're not looking at excluding elderly people or people that don't have the mental capability and other people, the unbanked that Michael talked about. So we're looking at these people or individuals as being part of society, and the Equality Act means that every individual has similar rights, the same rights, and this is the angle that we kind of took this article. We also looked at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. I know that was a bit of but it was just one of those things, doing research and just trying to find something so you can actually infer. When you look at the SDG goals, they were actually put in place for developing and least developed countries with regards to financial equality or financial integration. Thank you. This is what the SDG 10 was looking into. So sustainable goals with regards to social, economic and political inclusion. So I, kind of went there, and, it was something that we kind of looked into. Within the SDG goal, they did talk about policy makers also, looking at reducing inequality. So that would be everyone. It wouldn't be just developed or developing countries. So we're kind of thinking, okay, this is made for developing and least developed countries. This is an issue in developed countries. So this is something that we felt they should look into as well. So those were the two. I couldn't really find anything, that directly dealt with, what we were talking about. But obviously, when you look at the rules or you look at the acts or the legislation, they're kind of broad, and we can infer rights, even if it's not really or specifically detailed within the legislation.
A great irony that we felt we were potentially slipping in terms of where we stand against Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is financial inclusion, especially as fintech is driving forward financial inclusion in so many developing countries. If you just Google M-Pesa, for example, you have a great example of increasing levels of financial inclusion through fintech offerings, but that's not what's happening in the UK. Since Bhumi and I did write on this, the government has very kindly offered some legislation, which is the Financial Services Markets Act 2023. This allows the financial conduct regulators, that's the FCA, they're based in Stratford, by the way, to intervene to set some minimum access to cash standards, such as access to free ATMs and the ability to do counter services through the post office. But this only protects access to cash. It doesn't protect shops accepting cash. So really, it's only half the market, and only half the market isn't enough. So we're not very friendly with the legislation that's gone forward. We don't think it's gone far enough. The only thing we could suggest is there is existing law around public service obligations. They usually apply to large companies to make them do something that they wouldn't do of their own free will. So, for example, if you don't pay your water bill to Thames Water, they cannot cut you off from the mains water supply. They would want to, but they can't do it in law. That's a public service obligation. The Royal Mail has them, the Post Office has them too. And Bhumi and I asked the question in the article we wrote, one day, could we ever put the supermarkets under public service obligations to take cash? Because it does cost businesses money to cash handle. That's why for many of them it is preferable to take card. Now, there's one more point around the law which I'll introduce and then I will shut up. And that's this business of minimum card spends. That is a great barrier to those who are very low income, who have very precarious income, actually engaging with debit cards rather than paying in cash. There is no law to say that a minimum card spend is illegal. Maybe there should be, but that's a rather normativist statement, and I must be careful making those. Fortunately, most of the payment platforms, such as Visa and MasterCard, actually have service agreements which say that a shop cannot set a minimum card spend. Sounds great, doesn't it? The only problem is it's completely unenforceable, and many shops do set minimum card spends. A card transaction is not free for the person who owns the card reader. For a small business, whilst you have paid £3, the shop has received only £2.70, and for a £3 item, the profit margin is probably less than 30p. And again, you can see this as you talk to small business owners. I managed to get the guy who runs the newspaper kiosk in my local tube station to chat to me once, and he actually tells me it's better for him not to sell a newspaper if the person's going to pay by card, because the newspaper publisher will buy the newspaper back from him unsold for the strike price at cash. There are possibly some fintech-related solutions to this, especially around the adoption of a digital pound. That's a state-backed cryptocurrency where possibly the Bank of England controls the crypto wallet, or the Bank of England allows panel banks to issue this through their own apps without these very high transaction fees. But in this country, we're quite a few years off that, and we'll still have the digital exclusion problem in a state-backed cryptocurrency. So for as long as I think I'm wandering around the place, there is a need for cash, and the law does need to move to protect the 6% of UK adults who only deal in cash.
Thank you. So that's all we have time for today. Thank you both for coming in, and thank you to our law students for putting the questions forward, and to our listeners, thank you for listening in, and we will be back, and do stay connected. If you do wish to get involved with our Law, Policing and Justice podcast, please email legaladvicecentre@uel.ac.uk, and if you wish to explore more on the law, policing and justice and other courses, of course, please visit uel.ac.uk, and as always, thank you so much for listening, and stay well.